I want you to think, what is the most important subject in school? I think if you were to ask a lot of different people, especially those who are outside of school, I think the consensus would be science, because science teaches us the way that the world works. And so one of the great frustrations of teaching theology is the idea that some people think that the course in general is pointless. Well, when we get into ethics, it becomes pretty important, pretty significant, because now we're trying to determine whether or not a good life is worth living or a life based in virtue is worth living. I think ethics is really important, but I understand that a lot of people feel as if it's insignificant or pointless. The purpose of schooling is to learn, and is to become a well-rounded individual. I think a lot of people would assume that the point of school is to eventually get a job, but I think that's setting the bar very, very low. I want to learn, and I want to become a better person as a result of that, if I was in a classroom. And that includes a science class. But then there comes a really uncomfortable meeting between theology and science, because science deals with absolutes, and theology deals with something that very well could not be real. And so as a believer, and if anybody who takes a theology class is a believer, it gets uncomfortable because you're wondering, is there really any point to studying these things? Maybe you think that this class would be more meaningful if we actually discussed the issues that we're trying to argue about whether is right or wrong, or what the Catholic Church has to say about this or that. And I understand that, and I understand that it could probably be a little bit frustrating that we haven't gotten to that point yet. And we're dealing with a lot of different schools of ethics and a lot of different philosophers, and there doesn't seem to be a lot of purpose to this. But here's the thing, without understanding what these philosophers are saying, which is why I think normative ethics is so important, how can we even begin to start discussing whether or not certain issues are morally right or morally wrong? We're going to jump into a new section of ethics that deals specifically with the actual actions that we're dealing with. Remember, the three aspects of the moral act are intention, action, and consequence. It's very clear to at least Catholic ethics that there's some sort of emphasis placed on action. And so we're going to focus on that area, specifically through an individual philosopher who embodies this idea that action is the only thing that we need to look at in order to understand what is right and what is wrong. And so today we're going to look into the life and the teachings of Immanuel Kant. There's something really important to know about Immanuel Kant. He was born and raised in both a time and an era where Christianity was extremely, extremely devout. He grew up in a very devout Lutheran household, and so he and his family, their entire lives revolved around their Christian and Lutheran faith. And so we know him as Immanuel Kant, Immanuel, because he changed his name. That's the Hebrew spelling of the anglicized name Immanuel, Emmanuel. He was born Immanuel Kant in Königsberg, Germany in 1724, and then he changed his name once he learned Hebrew. So imagine growing up in the mid-1700s in Germany. This is a really weird time because although Christianity is a big part of everyday life, you also have the scientific revolution coming in. Kant is very interested in science and the rational mind. And so as he grows up and he studies more under those schools of science, he has a much more difficult time reconciling his faith with the real world, because remember, this Christian culture was not as rational as Christian culture is today. Here's a perfect example. As a Lutheran, he was taught a literalist interpretation of the Bible, which means that you take every part of the Bible literally, including the stories of Genesis, including the story of, like the Tower of Babel, the creation of Adam and Eve, Noah's Ark. These are stories that should not be taken literally. They should be taken allegorically, and yet he was taught that they actually happened. But as he moves away from that very restrictive Christian worldview, he still models those core beliefs that he grew up with in Christianity. You're going to come to realize that I get a lot of my worldview, I guess, from Immanuel Kant, because he teaches something that I often say. Humans are just so stupid in the context of existence at large. Kant teaches that as human beings, we are never fully going to be able to understand the concepts of the soul, let alone God. These are concepts that humans will never fully understand, and because we don't understand it, we reject them. This is a core teaching of Kant's philosophy. Kant's best-known work is his book, The Critique of Pure Reason. And this is going to be a really important book because this is going to be sort of our way of understanding the relationship between the theology aspect of this class, the philosophy aspect of this class, and on the other side, the scientific rational part of this class. Because I find, especially in young people, this is the moment in their lives where the world starts making less sense, or at least the world that they grew up in, because it seems like faith is contradicting reason. And so he wants to address this. We're going to be using a few big words, and so I'm going to explain these words as clearly as I can in order to make them a little bit more accessible and understandable. But just remember that the words that you're filling in, make sure you remember what they mean, because this is really going to help us understanding philosophy versus science. So whenever you make a judgment in your life, whenever you decide this is what I'm going to believe, or that's what I'm going to believe, or I'm going to reject that belief, I'm going to reject this belief, you're choosing between two things, two judgments that Kant calls them. The first are analytic judgments. When you're in a science or a math class, you're dealing with analytics. You're analyzing things that are for sure true. They're true by definition. When you're studying analytics, you're studying the what of something. But on the other hand, a different judgment is a synthetic judgment. And synthetic judgments are a lot more murky and a lot less understandable than analytic judgments, because this is your answering why. Whenever you ask the question why, you're dealing with synthetic judgment. So this is where philosophy comes in. So what Kant says is that every decision you make falls under two categories: those that are analytic and scientific, and those that are synthetic and philosophical. Now, this plays a huge role in philosophy and morality. Kant's understanding of the two types of knowledge. So think back to the ethical schools quiz that you took. Many of you were placed into specific ethical schools based on your answer to this question, but every single one of you should have answered this question. Do you think morality is something that is part of our human nature, or do you think it's a result of our environment? do you think that we are only products of our environment and there's no such thing as human nature? Kant answers this question with saying you can know in two ways. He says both. The first he calls a priori knowledge. And bear with me, I know these words are big and they're weird, but it makes a little bit more sense when it's explained. So make sure that you're really paying attention here. A priori knowledge is knowledge that you don't get from experience. Think of that word prior, before. This was something that existed within you before you even knew yourself. This is, I guess, what we could call human nature. So we can know some things, according to Kant, we can know some things prior to our understanding of ourselves. And that's a priori knowledge. But at the same time, we can also know things as a result of it being taught to us. So, our environment and our biases coming and instilling something in us by teaching us, this is what he calls a posteriori knowledge, or knowledge that comes only from experience. So here's an example. You are breathing right now, and you were never taught to breathe. It's just something that you understood as soon as you came out of your mother's womb. You knew how to breathe. And so the knowledge of breathing, knowing how to breathe, the ability to know how to breathe, would be considered a priori. Chances are you may have never heard of Immanuel Kant before this class. And so this was something that has been taught to you by me. And so the understanding and the knowledge of this person named Immanuel Kant would be considered a posteriori. So you can know everything through two ways, either a priori or a posteriori. So none of this is really new. The belief in God was very common at the time of Kant, and it was common among all human beings before Kant. And so the idea of a priori being a reality is not it's not a new idea. I think nowadays a lot of people think that a posteriori, or knowledge that comes from experience, is the only type of knowledge, and that's very clearly not the case because of breathing. So we haven't really dealt with anything unique from Kant at this moment, except Kant gives a very new thing that combines both the two types of knowledge, a priori and a posteriori, and the two types of judgments, the analytic and the synthetic. Remember, the analytic is dealing with science and math, and the synthetic deals with philosophy and contemplation. Do you think that I would be able to have this class with 7-year-olds? Of course not. I can barely have this class with you all. Chances are a lot of you aren't even listening to this part right now because you've tuned out or you're bored. I'm fully aware of that of that reality. And very few of you are super interested in this right now. And if you are interested in this, it's something strange and unique and weird. People tend not to be interested in this kind of stuff. I think I fall under that strange, unique, and weird category. So synthetic judgment, this ability to philosophize, is something that grows with experience, and it's something that is developed over time. The growth of wisdom lends itself to synthetic judgment. So you would think that synthetic, being the ability to philosophize, this thing that requires a lot of knowledge and experience, that would be with a posteriori knowledge, or it would be coupled with a posteriori knowledge, because a posteriori, these words are really hard to pronounce, that type of knowledge comes from experience. Kant says, I have an idea. I think that humans are able, even though we are really stupid and we can never understand the soul and we can never understand God, I think we can be able to come to a synthetic judgment. We can do philosophy that's a priori. we can naturally understand things. And this is really important when it comes to morality, because it's that natural understanding that leads us to believe in human nature, things we can't control and yet we know automatically, such as it's wrong to kill an innocent human. If I press you on that question, your response to me may be a lot different when you're 50 years old versus when you're 5 years old, but something that a 5-year-old and a 50-year-old can both tell me is that it is wrong to kill an innocent person. But to make the claim that it is wrong to kill an innocent person is not analytic. There's no math or science involved. Because there's a lot of people who think, for whatever reason, that murder is okay. So this is clearly not analytic, and yes, it's something that seems to be a priori. This is where Kant gets into the field of ethics. I am a huge fan of both Aristotle and Immanuel Kant, but they disagree on something really fundamental. When you make a good decision, when you do something that you know that you should do, let's say you volunteer. I wouldn't say everybody, but I think most people would say they feel good after volunteering. Go back to our junior retreat when we went to different places and we volunteered doing different things. Did you feel good about doing that? I went 2 days and 2 different days, and both days I felt like I was doing something good. I wasn't doing anything. I mean, when we went to the St. Vincent de Paul dining hall, all we did was sit down and eat and talk with the people that ate there. We weren't doing any labor, but yet that was considered volunteering, and it felt good because it felt like it was the right thing to do. So why do we feel good when we do a good thing, when we do a morally correct action? This is where Kant and Aristotle are going to disagree. Aristotle said, well, you're doing those things for your telos. This is, what you're meant for. It's your purpose in life. And your purpose in life is happiness, but you can only be happy if you're virtuous. Therefore, when you do virtuous things like volunteering, it makes you happy. Kant takes a different approach. He says, well, this is your moral obligation. This is something that you are supposed to be doing. And when you're meeting your obligation, you feel good. Growing up, and even today, I am a lifelong chronic procrastinator. And it was especially really bad when I was in high school because sometimes I wouldn't get the work done. And I would come into class not having my homework. I felt bad about that, not because I felt like I did something wrong, but because I felt as if I wasn't doing my job as a student. This is your job right now. You don't have another career. This is your life. To be a student is what you should be dedicating your life to right now. And so when you're being a good student, it feels like you are fulfilling your obligation. It feels like you're doing something virtuous. It feels like you're doing something right. Not because it is your purpose or it's your meaning in life, but because it's your obligation. That's something that Kant would be saying. This is something that Kant's understanding is a lot less accepted and a lot less popular than Aristotle's understanding, that a virtuous life is what leads us to happiness. Kant doesn't really care about happiness. He doesn't even really care about your telos, your purpose and your meaning in life. Well, we don't even know what that is, so why bother? So what we can do is we can imagine life as a mountain, right? And as you climb up, you're working your way towards the peak. The peak is the telos, and that's an analogy that we've used again and again. This goes back to Dante as well. The mountain of purgatory, the peak was where he was working his way up to. Well, Kant says your destination doesn't really matter. The peak, the telos, that's great if it's real, if it's there, if it actually exists. But you know what? What's more important is not the destination, it's the journey. It's the journey to that end goal, because we all go different ways in different directions. How do we know we're working towards the same telos? Do you think Hitler was working towards the same telos as Gandhi? Because their lives went in complete opposite directions. So Kant says, don't look at telos, look at the journey. Because the journey gives an understanding of who you are as a person, who you are as a human being. So if the destination is telos, what is the journey? Well, the journey, I think it's pretty clear to us, the journey is life. But Kant thinks, and he claims, that the journey itself is rationalism. It's thinking rationally, it's acting rationally. If you want to get to a good destination, you have to act with rationalism. Kant is very rational and focused on the idea that everything you do should be based in reason. So when you think about rationalism in like an educational context, you probably think of science and math. That's pure reason. That's pure rationalism. So what does that have to do with ethics? How does rationalism play a part in ethics? Because Kant is super into ethics. He's dedicated his life to the philosophy of ethics, and yet he is a pure rationalist. Well, how does that work? He comes up with a sort of test, a litmus test, to determine whether your action, the thing that you do, is moral or not, based solely on reason, not philosophy, not like, oh, well, whatever you feel. No, this is based solely on reason and analytic judgment. This litmus test that he devises, he calls the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative is going to be super, super important, so make sure that you're paying attention because we're going to go back to this again and again. So let's set up a scene. Imagine you go to a convenience store, and the person who's working at the convenience store has turned his back on you, and you don't have a lot of money, and you only came in to maybe, I don't know, get a bottle of water, and you only have money for that water, and you're desperate for the water. But you're also craving a candy bar. And when he turns his back on you, there's a candy bar right in front of you, and all you have to do is take it, put it in your pocket, and the owner of the convenience store, the worker, would be none the wiser. What should you do in this situation? Well, you all may come up with different answers. Some of you may say, well, no, you shouldn't do it because stealing is wrong. And some of you may say, well, yeah, stealing's wrong, but this is let's say it's a major chain. Let's say it's a 7-Eleven. 7-Eleven makes a lot of money. One candy bar is not going to really affect their bottom line. And the worker there, he could care less because maybe he's a teenager who's just working a minimum wage job. So really, you stealing that candy bar doesn't really hurt anybody. And it's just a one-time thing. It's not like you're doing this again and again. It's not like you're stealing something big. What should you be doing? Well, I'll take the candy bar because it's not that big of a deal. So you all may come up with different answers to that hypothetical situation. What Kant does with the categorical imperative is he says, okay, we're going to take a super rational approach so we can absolutely know what is right and absolutely know what is wrong. We can deal in absolutes when it comes to morality. What would happen if every single person alive followed your action that you're considering doing, which is stealing a candy bar in this situation? What if everybody in the world stole a candy bar from a convenience store? Kant comes up with a couple of explanations as to what would happen and how that will tell us whether the action is moral or not. If the end result is absolute absurdity, so in other words, it doesn't make any sense if everybody did this one action, or it would lead to total chaos and destruction, then that action itself is inherently an objective moral wrong. But on the other hand, if every single person in the world did that action, and the end result was maybe beneficial to some extent, relatively beneficial to humanity as a whole, then we can absolutely know that that action is inherently a moral good. So when we're looking at stealing the candy bar, what if all 7-8 billion people in the world stole a candy bar from a convenience store? Would it benefit humanity as a whole, or would it lead to total chaos and destruction? Well, it wouldn't lead to total chaos and destruction, and it definitely wouldn't be beneficial to humanity, but it would lead to the chaos of maybe 7-Elevens having to shut down because they lost so much money on candy. So in this case, Kant would say, all right, we've said that the categorical imperative, this test that our action undergoes to determine whether it's right or wrong, the categorical imperative has told us that this action is morally wrong because it leads to more chaos and destruction than good in the world. Kant came up with the categorical imperative because he was under the impression that all humans should act rationally, and rationalism was going to make life better. And so the way that he comes up with the categorical imperative is, first and foremost, when you're committing an act, do not make exceptions for yourself. What you should be doing is you should be acting as if it's a universal law, as if everybody has to live up to that law. There should be no exceptions, none whatsoever. Now, I won't agree entirely with that claim that Immanuel Kant uses, but I will agree entirely with this claim that Immanuel Kant uses, in that when we're dealing with human beings, when we're treating human beings in a certain way, we're thinking of committing a moral or an immoral act, and we're trying to determine whether it's a good thing or a bad thing to do. What we need to do, and somebody else is on the receiving end of this, what we need to do is that we need to understand that human beings are not means to an end, but an end in and of themselves. So an example is, I could make a ton of money if I could travel back in time and I can stock up on toilet paper and hand sanitizer and disinfecting wipes and those masks that are in desperate need right now in hospitals. If I had stocked up on that months and months ago, I could be making a killing right now. But that's me using other human beings and their lives as a means to an end. The end is making money. Kant says, do not do that. Make sure that the other person that you're acting with is an end in and of themselves. So my actions should be based on, okay, people need toilet paper, people need hand sanitizer, people need disinfectant wipes, and people need those masks. So what I should be doing is I should be treating those human beings who are in need of those things as an end, and I should be giving them to them without asking for money in return, and especially not by marking up prices. This is a big criticism among corporations, in that they seem to not be treating human beings as ends themselves, but as means to an end. And of course, the end is always money. Now, none of us are super important members of society. You're either teenagers or you're a religion teacher, a theology teacher. I'm sorry, but none of us are out there changing the world, truly. We're not politicians. We're not philanthropists. We're not business owners or entrepreneurs. We're really kind of like the lowest on the totem pole when it comes to society. Unfortunately, being somebody unimportant or relatively unimportant to society as a whole right now sometimes that means that we can start to justify our bad actions by saying, well, nobody really cares if I do this because I'm not really an important person. But imagine, and so here's what Kant wants you to do. Imagine yourself as a politician, as a lawmaker. Every rational being, every person who is rational, or if other animals have reason and rationality, they should be doing this too. Every rational being must act as if they were making the decisions for a bunch of other people, in the same way that politicians do, in the same way that bosses do. Act as if you are a legislating member and you're making rules for the entire world and not just for yourself. You're probably going to find that you make a lot of exceptions for yourself. And if that's the case, Kant is saying, stop it. Knock it off. Don't do that. Act as if everybody should be following that rule. And if everybody should be following that rule, you're included in everybody and you should be too. If you kind of think about it, this is just kind of, Kant is just giving us a more extensive version of the golden rule. Act in the way that you should be acting, because if you were on the other end, you would want the other person to be acting justly and rightly as well. So keep this in mind as we move forward in ethics and we move into Kantianism, because understanding, what is right and what is wrong, this is the issue when it comes to relativism. What if you just say, well, we can't really know what's right and wrong, and therefore everybody should have their own definition of right and wrong? Kant says, no, don't do that. Please don't do that, because I have found a way to come up with a rational explanation as to moral behavior. Use the categorical imperative. This is a rational test that is going to give you a very clear answer as to whether or not an action is right or wrong. The purpose of this class is to teach you all to be better members of society. In other classes, you're learning all of the tools to progress society, but what would be the purpose of that? What would be the purpose of all that talent and skill that you're getting better at if you're not understanding or you're not being taught what is right and what is wrong? Now, we could waste our time by saying, all right, let's debate abortion, good or bad, gay marriage, good or bad, euthanasia, good or bad. And we would just be arguing with each other, or we can start learning about what makes things right and wrong, and we can start to understand how to apply that to the rest of the world. You guys are old enough to where you're starting to see the issues in the world. Soon you're going to be old enough to vote, and then you get a voice in the shaping of the future. And so it's really important, rather than to just live in an echo chamber and just to listen to the people that agree with you, or just to, talk to a wall if you're talking to somebody who disagrees with you. Rather than doing that, start to understand what makes things right and wrong. And this is why Kant is so important, is because he's going to allow us to see an entirely new approach to morality and ethics. This is not just something that philosophers think about while smoking a pipe and wasting their time all day, while at the same time scientists and doctors are actually out there changing the world and making it better. No, this is something that's important. This is something that's worth pursuing. And it's something that's going to define how those doctors and scientists out there who are changing the world, how they behave, and the decisions that they're making. So we're going to spend a little bit more time on Kant, and hopefully this understanding of normative ethics and why things are right and wrong is getting across to you in some way.